Thank you everyone for joining. And hi everyone. Today is our ACL mentorship session, and our topic will be on building NLP datasets. And we're very honored to have three wonderful researchers joining us: Nathan, Anna, and Julian. And for the flow of today's mentorship, we usually do a 1-hour panel session, starting with 5-minute intro of each of the panelists. So basically consists from who you are, what you're working on, and also feel free to sketch out some bullet points, opinions on tips about building NLP datasets, and also some background for people joining this Zoom is that our main audience is mentees that sign up for ACL mentorship. So basically, most of the demographics are undergraduate students, master students, or people in other career stages that need research suggestions or career path suggestions. So at least in the previous sessions, we also had sort of panels, sort of Q&As designed in the way that if we're targeting at undergraduate students, here are the suggestions. If we're targeting at early year PhD students, here are the suggestions, or APs, here are the suggestions, and so on. With this background, we'll kickstart. And I think the default order, let's see, we can do the alphabetical order of family name. And we will start with Anna.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Marasović. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Utah, which is still kind of weird to say because I just finished a postdoc position at AI2. And my primary research interests are in explainability. So I haven't been publishing a lot on how to, collect what are the best practices for collecting data sets, but I am interested in global analysis of models, and that required collecting data sets that probe whether a model had learned certain skills, such as, for example, co-reference, where we kind of grounded that in reading comprehension. So I have experience with building data sets like that, and I'm happy to share my, whatever tips we had learned on the way, but I wouldn't say I have super strong opinions about how data sets should be collected. So I guess that's enough, or did I miss to address something?
I think that's perfect. And we will have sort of comprehensive opinions on how to build data sets that models are trained on and then evaluate on and understand them. So great. And then we'll move to Julian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julian. I am currently a PhD student at the University of Washington, although I am soon defending, and in theory, doing a postdoc at NYU starting in the fall. My research area, I've kind of dabbled in a little bit of everything, but my main focus is on kind of semantic representations, ways to annotate linguistic structure and language meaning. I've done a lot of annotations of data sets involving question-answer pairs. And I would say I probably do have strong opinions about data collection, but I can't guarantee that those opinions are justified. So yeah, I think data collection is really, really interesting. And I think it's super important for making progress in our field. So I think this is a really important topic to discuss. Yeah.
I guess it's my turn. So hi, I'm Nathan. I'm an associate professor at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And my specialty is also in semantic representations and resources for meaning, with a focus on linguistic approaches to annotation. And I worked on things like AMR, abstract meaning representation, and also now also universal dependencies and things that are more on the syntax side as well. So I agree with Julian that data sets are super important. Pretty much everything we do in NLP these days is empirical and therefore resolves around data sets. And so being careful about how those data sets are created and clear about what we can learn scientifically from those data sets or models evaluated on those data sets is really, really important.
Great. Thank you so much for the nice opening. I guess many of us have insights from different perspectives. So we're starting to receive questions on Slido, and then I can read out some of them, such as, maybe we could start with okay, great. So the one upvote is let's just imagine if it's a PhD student asking this question, and the PhD student want to publish a data collection paper at STAR ACL conferences, how much budget is usually needed for that? I guess we could also separate two different NLP tasks, if that gives a more deterministic answer, but it'll be very subjective.
So I can take it real quick. I think this is a really interesting question because I think it's also something that has potentially been changing recently. So it depends on what you want to use the data set for, whether you want to do training or evaluation. And it also depends on the kind of task that you want to use. So even some data sets with only hundreds of examples have been used popularly for evaluation if they were sufficiently difficult and high quality. And so in theory, it's possible to annotate a data set entirely yourself. And if you can make a good case for it, you can publish it. And you can use it for something. And technically, there's zero annotation budget for that. So I think it really runs the gamut. And it totally depends what you're doing. If you're trying to train an end-to-end neural model, then you're probably going to need on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of examples, and that's going to run into the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. But especially since a lot of work is using language models and few-shot learning and zero-shot evaluation and that kind of stuff, you can probably get away with on the order of 1,000 to 10,000 examples in a lot of cases. And this can make it a lot more manageable, actually, I think, to publish on a data set. So that's like big picture.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And I'll add that it can help to be creative about how you collect annotations. So one popular paradigm, of course, is crowdsourcing with something like Mechanical Turk. And there's the challenge is you have to formulate in your task in a very clear way that an ordinary person can understand. And then you have to do a lot of work to make sure you're not getting noisy responses and so on, and quality control. But there are other models you can use to collect data, and so that has an advantage of scale. If you get that approach to work, you can more easily scale it up to collect a lot of data quickly. But if you care a little bit more about quality or having insights into the data from the annotation process, then there are some other models that you can use in an academic setting, such as working in a lab and asking your lab mates to help you spend a little time creating data. One way I've been involved in this for some smaller data sets is like doing like a hackathon day, where instead of writing code, we're annotating data and get 10 or so people together, and that can be a lot of fun. Another model that we do at Georgetown is class sourcing, where it's actually part of the curriculum to annotate data. And Janet, who's one of our students, has taken this class where over the course of the semester, you're learning about different approaches to annotation and creating a data set that will be released at the end. so yeah, it's there are many options on the table depending on the type of data set you're creating.
These have been my experiences as well. I have created some data sets, by translating from English to German, and I'm curating them myself, which didn't cost, I guess, nothing but my time and paycheck. But I also created a data set where we crowdsourced with many people, and that costed tens of thousands of dollars. I think important thing to emphasize here is the biases we introduce when we annotate with a small group of people. So it really depends what you are trying to do. If you are having really focused study on a very specific linguistic phenomena, I think doing that with a small group of experts is usually better, in my own experience, than going and trying to do that on a crowdsourcing platform. But if you are trying to kind of find very creative, maybe question answer pairs, then it gets really tricky to do everything yourself. So what you are doing is really important here for making a decision of which kind of protocol you are going to use to annotate your data.
Great. I think we have mentioned multiple keywords that are very interesting, like the biasing Anna pointed out, and also the quality thing that we can see. I guess we can dive into many of them, and let me see which. So I also really like Nathan's suggestion on making a hackathon game doing class sourcing. I guess on the people level, so we can dive into the bias problem as a follow-up question, but a quick follow-up on Nathan's point is that for dataset collection, because of its importance, and also a recent challenge people have is that many NLP PhDs are CS background. Like at least a growing portion of them are CS background, and how to create the right incentive structure for them to know how important data sets are, be patient enough to collect data sets, care about qualities, which involve a lot of linguistic skills, humanities skills, HCI, or even management when there are multiple annotators. I think having the right structure so that people with the right expectation and skill set are in the position to collect good data sets. That could be more on the lab management side. And that's why I really like your suggestion on class sourcing, hackathon, and so on.
Yeah, I think it should be a skill that
in the previous reply, we also mentioned the bias.
I was just going
to go ahead.
I was just going to say it's a skill.
On my end. In that case, feel free to.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say it's a skill that I think is creating data sets is a skill that is important, and I would like to see it taught at more places as part of the curriculum.
Great, Nathan. Also, just curious, like usually for people aiming at doing data collection papers or people finding good co-authors, usually what type of skill set should people identify on potential collaborators to collect data set together with? Like, does it depend on their undergraduate major or certain characteristics that people do research and like they reflect?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that, but so I'm very lucky to have a lot of linguists and computational linguists to work with, students mainly, and so this is something that they're training in linguistics and things like syntax and semantics. Means they're prepared for the analytical thinking about how language works, which is then useful for annotation. But anyone has to learn how to do annotation and how to apply an annotation scheme. And some people just are naturally good at that kind of thinking. So I wouldn't say that you need linguistic training to be an annotator. I would say I mean, it depends on the kind of annotation, but I would say that it helps if you are interested in the data, right, and thinking about how language works. And so some of us really enjoy annotation as long as, you know, the annotation scheme is something interesting.
Great, awesome. Thanks for the insight. With this, we will go through the other questions from Slido from the most upvoted. I guess I balance a little bit between coherence with the previous question. So I go to the second upvoted question first and go back to the first. So we will touch the point of subjectivity. Since some NLP tasks can be very subjective, how do we address diversity, disagreements among annotators? I guess it sounds like we will have a combinatorial, like I feel like when annotating data sets, maybe a better framing of the question is that we only have a bundled set of things. So also inspired by what Anna mentioned, like let's say if we do a highly difficult task, then we will need the quality to be high. So the group of people will be small. And then there will be some bias based on this small thing, like small group. And then for some other task, it could be like the more crowdsourced idea is the better. Maybe the most famous example could be the Mara machine, where even for trolley problem, they get like lots and lots of reply, and humans percentage on the answers is the thing that researchers are interested in. But I guess like we'll combine realistic concerns and also what type of NLP tasks are there, what type of combination are there to address the question. So it'll be like how to balance or how to deal with subjectivity, maybe embrace them in some tasks and also reduce them in some other tasks. Not sure if the framing makes sense, but yeah, feel free to voice out your opinions.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think so one distinction that's worth making, and there was a recent paper about this, and I can't actually remember the terms that they used, but basically you can think about prescriptive versus descriptive paradigm of annotation. Like, what is it that the label is supposed to reflect? Is it supposed to reflect a prescribed idea that you have in your head, right? A function that you could, in theory, implement reliably on every input, and you just need the annotators to reliably reproduce that without making a mistake? Or are you trying to reflect the diversity of human judgment on certain examples? So like one of the classic tasks where this is difficult is textual entailment or natural language inference, where it's like, you know, you have two sentences and you say, well, if I read the premise, do I now believe the hypothesis to be true? But it actually depends on all sorts of extra kind of context that you might have to infer when you read the premise. And so there's this ambiguity or subjectivity in the judgment. And you can start to write rules to try to reduce that subjectivity, to kind of prescribe, well, this is the particular notion of entailment that we're interested in. Or you could kind of like take your hands off and say like, well, what I really want to gather is like people's intuition, whatever it is that captures, right? And which one of these you want to do probably depends on what you want to use the data for. And so I think that like one of the most important things to think about is, what do I think can be done with this data? What do I want to be done with this data? And can I adopt an annotation approach that actually makes that valid, right? You want ecological validity kind of maintained between your data collection and your data use. So the people who are using the data, the assumptions that they make about what are in the data match up with the assumptions that you make when you annotate it. I know this is very abstract, but this is like there are like 15 different things that we could probably talk about here. But that's just one that I think is useful for framing the issue.
I really love this opinion. Just to help people concretize the idea a little bit more, do you mind giving some examples, like maybe 2 examples in each case?
Yes. Oh, and yes, that looks like the right paper. Thank you for linking that in the chat. So
Maybe I can chime in
Yes.
an example for at least the first, I think it was the first protocol you described, where you're kind of giving rules and try to mold your annotators in a certain way of thinking and getting instances you are interested in. I would say we do this typically when we are trying to evaluate whether we are trying to collect a data set to evaluate whether a model can, solve a certain task or do a certain skill. And we want to say that, that the correct answer there means, yes, the model can do it, or otherwise the model can't do it. So we really need one, like a go-to answer to compare with. So any types of data sets that are kind of like stress testing or whatever, in a similar spirit, I think are trying to do exactly that, kind of remove any disagreement. In some of my own work, we had instances where annotators disagreed, and then authors manually checked which one of them are kind of real disagreement and which one of them the annotators just didn't get right. And we filtered out all of them where there is natural disagreement, because in the end, we really wanted to have just one gold answer. And that doesn't mean that these instances where there is disagreement are, bad or not interesting. It's just that it didn't fit the narrative we were, developing with this data set. And other type of protocol that Julian has mentioned about studying disagreement, I think papers that come to my mind are, as I think Julian already mentioned, about NLI, just showing that there is natural disagreement to these things, and that if you kind of ignore it completely in your annotation protocol, you're doing something incorrectly. There are definitely papers that show that in the context of NLI and presupposition, I think. So these are examples I can think of.
Yeah, and I think you gave me some extra time to kind of think through some more examples as well. So I think the prescriptive paradigm happens a lot in the more computational linguistics setting, where you're annotating explicit linguistic structure according to linguistic theory. So the approach to disagreement in these cases, where you have two different annotators who might disagree on how to annotate a structure, is they have to convene and basically decide, okay, can we settle the kind of degrees of freedom in our theory so that we all agree on how this particular phenomenon should be syntactically analyzed? So you're kind of giving more meaning to your annotations as you have these discussions and refine basically a theory of how the annotation should be done. And in theory, that's useful because now if someone sees a particular syntactic tree, right, they can look back at the guidelines, or they can look back at the discussions that happened during annotation and understand what that's supposed to mean. Of course, in the context of computational linguistics and linguistic theory, there's often so much content and material and discussion that goes behind these theories that it could be difficult for an end user to necessarily leverage all of that in their end task. And I think that's one of the challenging things about the prescriptive kind of paradigm, is you might end up specifying so much in your task guidelines that it's hard to actually make it all useful to someone on the other end, someone who's trying to use it, who may not have the same expertise. Whereas if you rely on the kind of descriptive paradigm, you're tapping into people's intuitions. And this can also be useful for kind of capturing things that we think are important, but that we don't yet know how to characterize. So a lot of kind of socially oriented tasks, I think, like toxicity detection, hate speech detection, stuff like this, where it's like we have many, many conflicting definitions, and it's actually not clear which one is right. Taking a more descriptive annotation approach, I think like one way to do it is basically like look at your pool of annotators, look at the diversity among them, and actually ask, like, look for the diversity in opinions and try to learn something about the task as a result. So I think this has been done for things like hate speech or like online misogyny, where you can actually try to learn about the phenomenon through collecting data. And I think that's where the kind of descriptive paradigm shines, where it's like the subjectivity is actually kind of the interesting thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that it's interesting in both. The disagreements can be interesting in both paradigms, because in the prescriptive paradigm, the disagreements show you something that you didn't anticipate, right, when you set up the categories or the original guidelines. Sometimes somebody just made an error, and that's fine. But often there are legitimately two different ways of interpreting the categories you have, and that's interesting. And also just language will throw things at you that you weren't expecting. So that's what I think is really fun about annotation is saying, okay, I have some initial hypothesis about what the categories are, and then, oh my gosh, here are all these new cases that I didn't expect, or that are somewhere in between the categories, or whatever. But yeah, so I think disagreements can be informative for both the prescriptive and descriptive paradigms. And there's been some work by people like Barbara Planck and Dirk Hovey on leveraging those disagreements. And there's actually a line of work on modeling annotators. So if you know the identities of annotators, who, annotators are contributing a bunch of annotations each, you can start to actually model their biases. Maybe there's one category that one annotator tends to prefer over another. Maybe some annotators are just better at the task, more accurate. So this is useful in crowdsourcing for filtering out noisy annotators. But I think it's also interesting to explore for, even if you trust the annotators, like what are their biases? Can you model that explicitly? Can you use that to help get to a better consensus answer, if that's your goal, or to better understand what's going on in the data, and so on. Yeah, so I'm trying to think if there's a bibliography of annotator bias.
Yeah, there is a paper from Israel, I think. Barbara
Planck is one person to look into. What were we saying?
I think there is a paper that studies exactly what you were describing. This one. Are we modeling the task or the annotator?
Yeah, I remember that paper as well. That seems to be a criticism of the model, saying that the prediction, like the label, is predictive given the annotator background.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also
said, this isn't. Yeah, I don't think this is related. I don't think this is quite the line of work I was thinking of, but
okay.
I think Todd has some work about like different demographics of the annotator and then how they affect the results. And then I guess we can also naturally progress to the most upvoted question about actual concerns about publishing a paper. I put a transition question here. Let's say if a student does dataset collection and then frame the research into a short paper or a long paper at STAR ACL conferences. And like a transition question here would be like, if the dataset is subjective with a lot of disagreement, what type of model should this dataset paper put into it?
Yes.
So go ahead, Julian.
Sure. Yeah, so I think I can kind of build on Nathan's comments about the annotator demographics and diversity as well, because I think it's a really good question. Like, if you build a data set and you find a bunch of disagreement, what do you do about it? And the way I see it, regardless of which paradigm you're in, you can use it as an opportunity to discover something. So I think one of the really interesting things that you can do with ambiguity or subjectivity or disagreement is ask, what are the factors that lead to this disagreement? And what's the extra context that's missing that, if I add it, can reduce the disagreement? And so I think this actually can help give insights about the nature of a task that can potentially be a really good contribution of a paper. But the thing is, you probably want to do this during the data collection process so that you have an opportunity to iterate. Like you definitely want to be keeping track of your data quality as you're going so that you don't run into this problem after you're already done. And so that you can start to run some kinds of experiments. So to kind of ground it in like explicit examples, one example that I think is really interesting of this is Google Translate added a kind of gender specific translation capability to certain languages and certain examples, where if you have a gender neutral pronoun in your source language in a simple sentence, it actually says, well, there are two different translations here. Here's a masculine one, here's a feminine one, if you're translating into a language that has gendered personal pronouns. And this is an example where, like, you can imagine if you were annotating this data and someone needed to write a translation, translating, say, from Turkish, which has gender neutral personal pronouns, to English, which has only gendered. Well, I guess actually it depends. That there are lots of things that are happening in English, but a lot of writers might, take gendered singular personal pronouns to be the only option, right? And so they would have to actually collapse the pronoun into, or the referent into masculine or feminine. And you can imagine this being a source of disagreement, right? So there are a lot of cases where, like, someone has to basically make some decision based on missing context. And this is an opportunity to actually improve your data, because you can maybe create a situation where you can give annotators the opportunity to say, well, here's the extra context I'm adding. And you could do that on the models, but you can also do it on the data side. So one project that I was involved in was called AmbigQA. And basically it's for ambiguous question answering. The point being that, when people type in questions to Google, we think of it as just input output, right? You input a question, you output an answer, but the question might be underspecified. There might be multiple possible ways of answering that question. And so actually this whole data set was geared around, well, can we find all the different possible answers and then write disambiguated versions of the question for each answer? That is like, well, if you meant this specific thing, then it'd be this answer. If you meant this specific thing, it'd be that answer. And I think that, like, in almost any case where you find disagreement, you can start to ask, well, what are the different factors that lead to this? And you can start investigating this in your data. And so if you produce a data set and you find this disagreement, and then you just approach it with curiosity and try to investigate these kinds of questions, what are the factors that lead to disagreement? You can figure out, well, is this a problem with my data quality that really means my data set isn't useful? Or does this reflect something really interesting about language, something really interesting that I can actually present as a further finding? So try and find, I guess, further findings would be one way of looking at it.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, it seems to me every time I find something interesting about language and data, I'm also like, but how to mold this into a standard evaluation paradigm? And there is a huge tension between these two things, because you want to build a data set that people will use, that, will be widely adopted. And if you have this very specific, very particular types of evaluations, I'm not sure whether the data set will be as used as if you went back to your data and removed the disagreement in the way you describe, by, specifying your questions better. So there is that tension. And when I encountered this the last time, I had found all these papers that say, oh, you should embrace ambiguity, you should embrace diversity of potential answers. But there is little work on actually providing protocols for evaluating these kinds of things. So I think we need more work also in providing evaluation protocols, different metrics to deal with these kinds of things. Because, of course, I can generate, let's say we have a wrong presupposition, and the model can then say, whatever answer, let's say, I don't know, or unanswerable because, and then explain that the presupposition was wrong. But now we are in the realm of evaluating text generation, which is itself super hard. So definitely, I would say to anyone who wants to deal with this ambiguity, to also think about these evaluation protocols. I think these contributions there could be really, really impactful.
Yeah, so to add to that, for many years, I've been mainly reviewing for the resources and evaluation track at conferences. And I would really encourage people to submit to that track if your main contribution is in resources or evaluation, as opposed to, working on trying to improve the state of the art for some established tasks. So in the resource evaluation track, the reviewers will be looking for, what is interesting and novel about the problem such that you decide to create a data set for it. What is new about your data set? What are the linguistic challenges you encountered? What are the methodological challenges maybe you encountered if you were doing crowdsourcing and things like that? And for these kinds of papers, I think it's helpful to have a lot of examples and really, excite the reader in what makes this data set interesting. And also maybe to include some, baseline model results to convince them that this is a challenging task for existing systems or whatever.
Great. Thanks so much for all the insights, and especially we naturally transition to some more grounded concern if people are publishing their first data collection paper, the actual research components to add into it. And then from Nathan's comment at last, the most important thing for the dataset paper, at least I also feel that, is the motivation. Why is such a dataset, in addition of all the existing ones, interesting? Could we say that it's, I'm just thinking about more concrete suggestions to provide to people. So it'll be as complete as possible description of the data sets, the motivation, and then a little portion about running standard baselines. And just a lot of analysis results, things like that.
Analysis is important. Analysis of your data, like describing statistics of your data, challenges that annotators encountered, inter-annotator agreement measures, that kind of thing. So try to be as precise about all of the steps you went through as possible when creating the data set, and to explain what's in it, what kinds of language are represented, what groups of speakers are represented, all of that. I think the machine learning or modeling of trying to get computers to do a task automatically is maybe less important for that kind of paper.
Got you. Great. Go ahead.
Please also write your crowdsourcing instructions super precisely and clearly in your paper, because it's really hard to understand what's going on if that's not provided. I usually just de-anonymize my MTurk templates and share them with the submission, so reviewers can directly go and see templates themselves. And of course, if paper is accepted to a venue, I also release that with the code and everything. Very often, I simply cannot find crowdsourcing instructions at all, and that's then really hard.
Make it hard to replicate.
Yeah, it sounds like it doesn't need to be said, but judging by the number of paper I've seen without crowdsourcing instructions, yeah, please share them.
Yeah, did you mean anonymize?
De-anonymize, that's what I meant. I don't know what I said. Oh no, sorry, I meant the other way. Make it anonymous. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I said the other way around.
Great. And then is there a distinction between short and long paper? Like what is let's say what suffices for a short paper, and what additional stuff need to be really strong for a long paper?
I guess it's just a matter of originality is the main thing I would say. So if you're, one thing that if an annotation approach has already been done for a smaller data set and your contribution is doing it for a larger data set or a different text, and there's not anything really novel about your approach or new about your approach, then maybe that's more of a short paper. But if there's more to say about what new thing you did and why it was interesting, then that's what can make it a long paper.
Yeah,
Cool.
to give some concrete example as well, when we publish CoRef, which is dataset for reading comprehension with co-reference, a lot of co-reference inside, we wrote it as a short paper because co-reference is well-known phenomena, and reading comprehension is a well-known task. We use annotation protocol that has been, bits and pieces from other work. So we didn't need to describe everything in detail. We just need to say how we combine it all together. And we ran some baselines and did some analysis, and all of that fit into a short paper. So definitely, if you have something like that, writing a short paper is completely fine.
Great, thanks for the insights on this. And then the next upvoted question is a pretty profound one. So the person asked, how do we get the community to value dataset collection more and to consider data collection important? I guess this could break into several things, like how do we position data collection in our NLP community? What role does it play? And then is the current effort matched with that? If not, what are some ways forward?
Yeah, I love this question. I don't have a simple answer, but I will say a couple related comments. First, I think I saw a talk from Ed Hovey where he pointed out that the shelf life of a data set is often a data set paper or a data set is often much longer than the shelf life of a model, right? So you think about the Penn Tree Bank still being used, decades later, versus the whatever algorithms or models people were using at that time. The models change very fast, and the state of the art changes fast, but data sets can have a longer term impact. So that's an incentive for serious work on resources, I think. But in terms of getting the community to value these things more, I think I would add another challenge is not just data set collection, but data set maintenance. So especially for linguistically oriented data sets, no data set is perfect, and sometimes you are better off going through after it's been released and improving it in various ways. We've been doing a lot of this in the Universal Dependencies project, where we try to have cross-linguistically compatible approaches to describing syntax trees. And we discover things in some languages where the scheme doesn't work so well, and then we have to go and revise the scheme and revise all the data. I find that the incentives are even harder to figure out to get people to work on revising data sets, because it's not seen as original. But it is really important for the community to have, if we're going to be studying cross-linguistic variation in syntax, to have data sets that actually can back up those questions.
Yeah, I also think this is a really interesting question because, well, for example, what Nathan said about Ed Hovey's comment about the shelf life of data sets, I think it's actually true that data sets are valued quite a bit. If you look at the amount of citations, if you look at the degree of use, if you look at like how much is actually produced on the basis of a good data set, it's quite a lot. And it's often worth the investment, but I think there's an idea in the community that that's not necessarily true, that they're undervalued. And so people might work on them less accordingly. And that means there's an opportunity for arbitrage, right? Like if you think that data sets are undervalued by the community, that means, hey, work on data sets and you can have a big impact. And I think that's true. And I think, the long shelf life of data sets does show us that. In terms of like how to change the way that the community thinks about it, like your guess is as good as mine. It's kind of like, how do you change the way that people think? I mean, as like a broad philosophical perspective, one way that I've been thinking about it is we talk a lot about like grounding models in the world. And I think like you can think of data as the thing that connects models to the world, right? Like a model is just this abstract set of numbers. The only thing that connects it to any part of reality is the data set. And so as data set creators, we're kind of the curators of digital reality. And if you say data set creator, it's like meh. If you say curator of digital reality, it's like, oh, you know.
I'm gonna start calling myself a digital reality curator.
So, you know, I don't know, ways of selling the idea of really trying emphasizing the importance of data creation, right? It's like the decisions that you make and how to represent something in data could have like very, very powerful knock-on effects in models that are kind of use that data directly or indirectly. So yeah.
I would also say that there is also, in at least, maybe I'm wrong, but I seem to see there is a positive trend in how data sets are appreciated in community in the recent years, and I think that's because the scale of the models have become so large that people kind of shifted away from trying to, you know, chase the state of the art and rather think about stuff like, oh, there are these phenomena that no one investigated. How can I frame it as a task? How can I collect data for it and bring into reality, as Julian says. So I don't know, I see kind of positive trend, and there is now a dedicated track for resources at all ACL conferences. There are best paper awards for resources, and I don't know, I personally didn't have problems publishing a dataset paper. These papers are also well cited, so I think a lot has changed in the last year or two as well.
I think the community is kind of starving for interesting data, like more than it used to be the case. Like my first data set papers that I worked on, it was like kind of hard to get them through review. People didn't really get the point. But I think now people are like, oh, interesting data, great, right? We need more of this.
Yeah, that's my impression as well.
Yeah, sounds very interesting. Like the trace of review opinions, like the value at NLP communities over the years. Great. And then we have 3 remaining questions. I think in respect of everybody's time, we will just do 1 to 2 short reply to each question. And then I go over them really quickly. I'll say all the 3 questions together. The first one is, any thoughts on collecting dialogue data sets? Something to keep in mind and look out for. The second thing is about, when constructing data sets for fair NLG systems, what are some approaches to the study design to incorporate human evaluation at scale? And any paper references for that? Oh, the other thing is a little bit overlapped with our previous thing about disagreement. And then what factors to consider while validating a data set for low resource languages? So they're a little bit like specific questions. One is dialogue dataset collection tip, NLG system evaluation at scale. And the third one is low resource language validation of data sets.
So I have not collected dialogue data sets per se, but I can give some kind of brief general thoughts. Is the interface matters a lot. I think data set collection and task design and instruction writing and managing, like all of these things together form a very distinctive skill that can be learned, but that kind of has to be learned in practice. And that, you know, whatever data you're gathering, you really need to think about the user experience. Like put yourself in the shoes of the annotator. And if there's anything that's like confusing or inconvenient or kind of a hassle, think about that, right? Like when you're annotating hundreds and hundreds of examples, these things build up. And a little bit more effort on the part of the person making the interface can make an enormous difference to the retention of annotators and the quality of the data. And so being very, very detail oriented, thinking very hard about the user experience and being willing to put in a lot of work. Think about it, like for every minute, you know, if I can save like a single annotator a few seconds on a single instance, just think about how that multiplies. Yeah, and I think that probably will be especially important with dialogue, where it's like you have very complex annotation setups. You have to be willing to get into the weeds.
Yeah, I totally agree that the user interface is really important, and also piloting the task is over multiple rounds, because users will do things you don't expect, and they'll misunderstand things in ways you don't expect. So don't expect it to be that you just come up with the perfect annotation task, and then can go collect tons of data.
Great. And then the other aspects are constructing data sets for fair natural language generation systems, how to incorporate human evaluation at scale for NLG, and then low resource language data set validation.
I can comment a little bit on evaluation of NLG because I work on generation of explanations in free text in plain language, and evaluation for that kind of work requires human evaluation. So usually we go to MTurk, we give a sample of our generations. We ask for every instance, at least three annotators to rate how well does that explanation justify the answer. We turn 4 options into numerical scores, and then we average the scores of 3 annotators, and then the average of all the averages in a sample. So usually we can't do this at scale. Our sample size is typically around 350 instances, and I don't have a suggestion of how to scale that up. I just know that it's absolutely necessary to do human evaluation for certain NLG tasks, because some of the available automatic measures simply do not capture anything related to the phenomena. So the correlation between human judgments of, let's say here, plausibility and any automatic measures we have right now is super, super low. So you can't avoid it, but I also don't know how to scale it up. So typically when you write a paper like that, reviewers won't penalize you for that, because most likely they themselves don't have a better idea and can't require from you to evaluate a lot of instances. But that's a great research direction to think about if you have ideas. And for low resource languages, all I can say, I didn't work much on low research languages myself, but I would definitely point everyone to Masakane and their paper on participatory research and how to involve people on all, on different levels, from curators to content creators, and, people who really speak those languages. I think is super, super important. Yeah, that's all I can say on that topic.
Yeah, so I've done a little bit on NLG evaluation. I wouldn't say it's my specialty area, but one trick that I think is useful is, instead of asking for absolute score judgments, because different people have different biases, you can ask for rankings. So you can give them the output of 3 different systems and ask them to rank them. And I think that is one type of evaluation that sometimes is maybe more scalable or more reliable in some settings. But NLG evaluation is a very hard problem, and yeah, there's usually not a simple answer.
Yeah, I linked an example of this in the chat. So OpenAI had a paper on reinforcement learning for summarization, where they used basically preference judgments, binary preference judgments at scale. And I think this can be one way of getting more reliable judgments. The problem is you get so little you get reliable information, very little information from an individual judgment. So it scales, but you have to really operate at a very large scale. And I would actually encourage, if you're interested in that paper, to look in the appendix at their description of how they interacted with the annotators and how they specified how to rank the summaries, because there was clearly a huge amount of work that went into it. And I think it's like, it reveals a little bit about just how hard this problem is, and that if you want to scale it up, you actually might need to have a lot of resources on the team that's running.
Yeah, and there are many different kinds of NLG. So summarization is very different from translation, which is very different from, question answering and so on.
Great. Thank you so much for all the very insightful comments. And I also learned a lot throughout this panel. I feel like this is much more profound than I thought after the panel. And also thank you everyone, including the panelists and also our very active attendees on Zoom, recommending a lot of pointers and interacting with follow-up questions. Also today's panel, we touched low-level suggestions like budgets and how to frame a paper so that people can actually use them, and also high-level insight of how the community should treat subjectivity, where should data collection go in the community, and so on. So really, again, a great honor to collect all the wonderful different perspectives from all three of you, Nathan, Anna, and Julian. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for organizing. This was really fun.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, same here.